Morning. I find myself reacting with some amusement to today's readings, deadly serious as they have the potential to be. Forgiveness, of course, we see in abundance, but it's mixed throughout with a fairly significant leavening of pure crafty humanity in all of its flawed glory. In Genesis, Joseph's brothers sidle up and work to convince him that, hey, bro, Dad totally wanted you to forgive us. In Romans, we're told, who are you to pass judgment? And in Matthew, we see a man forgiven much who, rather than recognizing the grace he's received and sharing the love, turns around and wreaks vengeance on another. So what do we do with all of this? We're called to forgive. We are told not to pass judgment on our fellow humans. And yet we also see that transgression of the call to forgive brings some bad results for the vengeful slave. Clearly somebody's judging him. Without the sting in the tail of Jesus' parable, we might find ourselves descending into moral relativism. If we must forgive, if we must not pass judgment, then does anything go? Matthew, though, signals that there may be some parameters to consider, and I'd suggest that Paul does in Romans as well. How are we called to forgive? Jesus didn't say 77 times or 70 times 7 to give the disciples a times table refresher. The point here is profligacy. God's grace is profligate. But God's advice to God's people through Jesus and through Paul is grounded in a vision of God's kingdom in which God's rules overtake human regulations. You heard Pastor Melinda say that I'm trained as a historian. My expertise is American history, but it tends to be the lens through which I look at everything. So whenever I'm looking at biblical stories, I'm thinking about the context in which these people were living. And Jesus and the disciples and Paul and his audiences lived in the Roman Empire, right? Life under the authority of the Roman Empire took place within the context of what we call an honor-shame culture. It was a complicated series of reputational debits and credits in which you strove, to the degree that you had any control over your life in the first place, to gain honor and avoid shame. This was very important because life was zero-sum. Everything added up at the end. So one person's honor came at the expense of another. Or perhaps I should say one man's honor came at the expense of another, because unfortunately some of us didn't have a lot to start off with. But weakness in general was something to be exploited. Power and influence were achievements that you would hoard. That was the way society worked. The inborn advantages one gained from the good fortune of birth into high status or favored identity were ascribed to nature. These people not totally different from today, right? Very unfortunately. We presume that we pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, however logistically impossible that might be, and we ignore the advantages of things like skin color or federally subsidized housing loans for some groups or grandpa's GI Bill bachelor's degree. The simple fact that we wake up here in the Pacific Northwest, right? And we're not in New Delhi or Nairobi or Morocco or Libya or places that are suffering so greatly. All of us exist within a network of systems and relationships. Both systems and relationships may be things we signed off on. They might not. And most of the time, they're tangled up in an inextricable web of power dynamics. Honor and shame by a modern name. We have control over some things. We don't have control over others. It all winds up kind of interwoven, right? So those of us who were born female, for example, didn't choose to be born. Misogyny. That's something that we simply inherit. My ancestors who were Cherokee didn't choose to be driven off their land in the southeastern United States and move forcibly to what's present-day Oklahoma. Again, not something in our control. But on the other hand, we also work within systems where we have some control. The name of my third great-grandfather is John Ross Adair. That indicates the family made a conscious choice, exercised their power, their agency to identify with one political strand of the Cherokee Nation. As Cherokee leader, John Ross grappled for power with other tribal leaders. The fact they named a son after him indicates what side they came down on, right? And most of us choose to live here in the city of Portland, where we encounter ingrained systems of inequity. Again, I'm a historian, I could go off, but I'll spare you. And a political landscape that means that my daughter's school librarian can showcase a diverse array of books rather than hiding them behind the counter. Everything is mixed up. We're dealing in this imperfect world of complicated systems, complicated relationships, from our past and our present, likely in the future. Webs of honor and shame, status that is acknowledged and unacknowledged. And at this point, we can take a closer look at today's lessons. Matthew gives us an account of someone who lacks a sense of perspective about the systems and relationships in which he finds himself. This slave receives a gift wildly out of kilter with first century expectations of what a powerful person would do for a slave. Massive debt is forgiven. 10,000 talents is like 150,000 years' wages for somebody like this slave. This is just completely out of scope of anything that one could expect. How could this guy have racked up that much debt? It's a ludicrous story. On some level, the sheer size of the debt might have limited at first for Jesus' hearers the power of hearing that the owner bucked honor-shame culture entirely and forgave the slave's debt. I mean, if you're in the world of fairy tales already, what's one more improbable twist? But then comes the kicker. The slave encounters his fellow slave, a person of similar status in the honor-shame hierarchy. And that slave owes 100 denarii. That's about 100 days' wages for someone in this social position. A lot of money, but this falls within the realm of possibility, right? We can probably envision, and Jesus' hearers probably could have envisioned somebody with this level of debt. The slave who has received such lavish forgiveness, however, fails to get the message, fails to understand how he can live into a different vision of what community and relationship can look like, and he fails himself to forgive. He destroys the life of the debtor, but as well, we can see that he tears the fabric of relationship in his local community. It's his fellow slaves who are greatly distressed, and they're the ones who tell the owner. The call to forgiveness then comes within a context. The slave's lack of perspective leads him to make a terrible decision. He chooses an attempt at honor and at shaming somebody else over grace, status over God's alternate vision of relationship, and as we read, he pays the price. Turning to Romans, we don't get a story, but we do get some pithy advice, somewhat pithier than usual, in fact. Paul's letters can be confusing sometimes, and the man loves a good run-on sentence. Those of you who are charged with reading the lessons on a Sunday will be familiar with this. But here, though, we see that these epistles were letters to people living the messy business of what it meant to be in community. Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. By using weak, we see Paul himself making a value judgment, despite his repeated observations that we aren't to judge. So why, beyond plain human contradictoriness, which we can't discount, Paul was human, might Paul be doing this? I suspect it's because he's talking to a specific group of people dealing with specific questions and issues. In this case, the church in Rome. We know that people are different. We come from different backgrounds and cultures, different networks of relationship, different societies, different places within those societies. And I imagine the church in Rome was a relatively diverse place, given its center at the hub of the Roman Empire. But it was a church in Rome composed of people who were absorbing the teachings of the early church and learning things like that dietary laws were not necessary. But not everyone they encountered, everyone who expressed interest in this new way, would share that understanding. Some of them were going to hold to different traditions. And even as Paul gives a nod and a wink to the understanding that dietary restrictions weren't necessary, those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. All of them. The community needs to stop playing the honor-shame game of power dynamics. And in the way Paul phrases his statement here, he delivers a tacit acknowledgement that the so-called weak may actually have some grounds on which to judge the non-abstainers if we're going to go on playing in human terms. It all depends on perspective, on what angle you look at this conflict from. And the point isn't who's weak or strong. The point is the not judging. So what are we to do with this? Do we just let everyone do what they want willy-nilly because it isn't our place to judge? Well, sort of, in the sense that generally speaking, humans do well to operate very cautiously in the judgment department. The point that underlies all this, though, lies toward the end of today's reading from Romans, when Paul quotes from Isaiah, "As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God." The point here is the everyone. We hold our judgment because in the examples Paul provides here, dietary laws, festival days, despising our siblings for their cultural practices and societal positions, judgment serves to exclude some of the everyones Jesus seeks to bring into the kingdom. What are we holding on to that keeps others away? Where is our perspective failing? Where are we preserving the vestiges of our 21st century honor-shame culture rather than subverting the systems that serve? There we find our calling. And the good news, the really good news, is that as Joseph told his crafty brothers, even amidst the harms of this world, pain God did not cause, but in which God comes to join us, God can overcome evil with good. We don't owe those 150,000 years of back pay because our wrongs have been forgiven. In Thanksgiving, let's go and do the same in our own relationships. We don't have to play the game the world gives us. God has set us free to forgive, to love amid differences, to prioritize community with each other. Thanks be to God.